Moving into the second phase of our prototyping, the goal remains the same: inject visual variety and break up the monotony. We left off in room 2 adding columns after adjusting the height of room 1, so let's maintain that momentum. I'm placing columns in the corners to add definition, and I may even drop some along the center of the walls if the repeating patterns feel too flat. Sometimes you can't tell if a wall is too repetitive until the final textures are applied, so we'll keep moving for now. Remember, level design is iterative. You can always circle back and add detail later. Test your level early and often. Don't just check the mechanics, pay attention to the flow and how the space feels. Even with these placeholder assets, you'll get a sense of the scale. Now, I'm treating the pit in room 3 just like the one in room 2. I'll extend the walls downward and add a black floor to create that bottomless look. I'll switch to unlit mode to see the geometry more clearly, though we should probably add more light soon. With everything selected and snapping set to 100, I'll duplicate and drag the walls down. Since this room is wider, I'll pull the walls down even further to ensure the depth looks right from a player's perspective. I'll drop this down twice more to get the depth right. I'm just grabbing the gizmo and dragging it down. Let's do a quick playtest to check the view from the edge. That looks solid. Now let's bring the floor in. I'll slide the floor piece into position and swap the material to that black grid texture we created earlier. I noticed some of these pieces weren't organized, so I'm moving them into the room 3 folder now to keep the project clean. To speed things up, I'll shift-click to grab multiple pieces, then Alt-drag to duplicate them all at once. Testing it out again, the pit looks great. You might notice some flickering on the edges of the screen. That's just a minor lumen artifact in the editor. It shouldn't show up in the final build, so don't let it distract you. With the pit finished, I'm adding columns here as well. I'm not sticking strictly to the grid because these are meant to break up the lines, not blend into them. I also want some structural support under the catwalk, so I'll use these same columns as beams rising from the floor to make the ledge feel more grounded. I'll stack these by duplicating a column and centering it under the catwalk. I'm placing a few more as I move outward, but I won't drag them all the way to the floor. Since the pit is dark, the base won't be visible anyway. If our lighting changes later, I can always add more geometry, but for now, I'm avoiding unnecessary pieces to keep things efficient. A quick playtest shows the supports are doing their job, so I'll just nudge them slightly for a better look. Even where the platform meets the wall, adding columns helps the structure feel grounded. A common mistake when starting out is leaving levels too empty. If you're working with a team, a sparse blockout doesn't give artists much to work with. While I won't be adding every tiny prop in this tutorial, these principles show you how to flesh out a space. I considered adding an overhang here, but I'm overcomplicating the geometry. I'll scale that back for now. As you work with snapping and layouts, you'll develop a natural feel for what fits and what's overkill. As you build more levels, remember you can also use slight scaling to create overhangs without extra columns. Just be careful not to overextend. Ensure everything aligns properly so you don't leave any ugly gaps or seams. Always verify your columns reach the ceiling. These gaps are hard to spot in unlit mode, so toggle your view often to catch them. I'm only extending the geometry down until it disappears into the shadows. There's no need to model details the player will never see. Looking at room 3, the ceiling feels too low for the grand scale I'm after. I'm going to raise it by 1 wall unit, about 4 meters. This isn't just for looks. My design document includes falling blocks in this section, and they need enough clearance to drop. By raising the ceiling, I'm making a choice that is both aesthetic and functional. I'll select the entire ceiling area now to ensure we have consistent height across the whole path. I'll start with this section first. Setting my snapping to 100 makes this simple. I'm raising the ceiling by 4 meters. Testing it out, the extra headroom feels much better. Now I just need to patch the resulting gaps in the walls. In lit mode, I'll grab the northern wall and Alt-drag it up to fill the space. I'm intentionally keeping the ceiling lower over the entrance platform. By forcing the player through a cramped space before revealing this taller room, the verticality feels much more dramatic. Contrast is key for making a space feel massive. I'm dropping in another light with a higher intensity and a wider radius just to see what I'm doing. Next, I'll stack duplicates of the columns to reach the new height. I'm still undecided on whether to keep the specific corner low or raise it, so I'll stick with the lower ceiling for now and see how it feels during playtests. Finally, I'll adjust the grid snapping to create a slight overhang and mask that flickering Z-fighting on the surfaces. I'm using more columns to clean up the edges. I'll place one as an overhang, then duplicate and rotate it to align the pieces. It's looking much better. Since I've cranked up the lights to work, you can see exactly where the geometry ends. Depending on your final look, you'll either need to extend those walls further or dim the lights back down to that dark, moody atmosphere we started with. You could spend hours fiddling with wall indents and custom setups, but for this tutorial, I'll keep it moving. I'm adjusting the placement here to fix some flickering, but I have to be careful not to make the passages too narrow. Our 4-meter doorways are plenty wide, but if you're working with tighter spaces, always playtest to ensure your character doesn't get stuck. A beautiful level is useless if it's not traversable. The ceiling height feels right now. I might add a few more columns off camera, but the concept is clear. I'm placing one crossbeam here to visually partition this section. Later, when we prototype interactive items, this is where we'll put a health pickup. Marking the space now makes that area feel more intentional. Just remember, level design is iterative. You might build something today that doesn't fit your needs tomorrow. Don't be afraid to tear things down and change them if the design evolves. If you notice a red X appearing on your light icons, it simply means too many light sources are overlapping in one spot. You have a few ways to handle this. You could shrink the attenuation radius until the X vanishes, but that might ruin the look you're going for. Alternatively, you can move or delete some lights to reduce the clutter. The most straightforward fix for now is changing the light's mobility. By default, lights are set to stationary. If you switch a problematic light to movable, the X will turn into a set of green arrows. While movable lights are technically more demanding on performance than stationary ones, they are much better for your frame rate than leaving a bunch of overlapping stationary lights that the engine can't calculate efficiently. You don't need to change every light, just switching 1 or 2 in the cluster to movable usually solves the conflict. I'll do that now just to keep our workflow smooth. Now, let's head into room 4. We'll follow the same process as before, extending the pit walls downward to hide the void. You can actually see the exterior of the previous room's walls now because we pushed them down so far, so let's get this room matching that depth. Let's get to work. I'm going to stay in lit mode this time. Switching to unlit makes it too hard to distinguish between the geometry of different rooms. This is exactly why I organized my ceilings into separate folders. I can just hide the room 4 ceiling to get a clear, top-down view of the entire area. I'll select every piece along the perimeter of the pit. Using Alt-Drag, I'll pull the walls down. Since the new geometry stays selected automatically, I can immediately Alt-Drag again to double the depth. I noticed I missed one wall segment, so I'll just manually duplicate that down to match. Let's check the progress with a quick playtest. It's looking solid, but I think I'll go one more level deeper just to be safe. It's the same routine: grab the walls, find the gizmo, and drag. Now for the floor. I'll pull a floor piece from the content browser, snap it into place, and apply that black material. I'm also making sure to move these new assets into the room 4 folder to keep things tidy. One issue: you can currently see the bottom of our floating platforms, which ruins the infinite pit illusion. I won't just scale the platforms downward to hide this. While the grid texture might look okay stretched, a real art asset will look terrible later. Instead, I'll duplicate the platform walls downward, just like we did with the room's perimeter. As long as our final textures are set up to tile correctly, the transition between these pieces will be completely seamless. I'm going to raise the ceiling height here as well. Looking at it now, we're running into the same issue we had in the previous room. The ceiling is just too low. While the other room needed clearance for falling blocks, this one is purely about the player experience. Right now, when the character jumps, they nearly hit their head, which feels cramped and awkward. I'll select all the ceiling tiles positioned over the pit area and move them up by 4 meters. I debated only doing 2 meters, but 4 feels right for the scale of this level. Since we're using the same wall segments anyway, the height adjustment is a simple fix. Before I get into the detailing, let's do a quick playtest. Coming through the entrance, jumping, yeah, that feels much more natural. The extra breathing room makes a huge difference. Now let's bring in some columns to break up the flat surfaces. I'll grab an existing column to save time on rotation and snap it into the corner. Even though the lighting is currently dark and hides most of the detail, I'm making sure everything is perfectly aligned. If we brighten the room later, I don't want any glaring geometry errors popping up. I'll make sure these are all organized in the room 4 folder as I go. I'm seeing some Z-fighting here, that flickering texture issue, so I need to nudge these pieces. For those following along with the terminology, these vertical supports are called posts and the horizontal beams are lintels. I'll drop both down slightly to separate the surfaces and kill that flickering. That's much cleaner. To help me see the space better during this blockout, I'm going to bump up the indirect lighting intensity. This floods the shadows with extra light. It isn't exactly realistic, but since we aren't aiming for a hyperreal look right now, it's a great way to make sure the geometry is actually lining up. I'm happy with the progress, but I want to add even more visual interest to the ceiling. Instead of one flat, high surface, I'm going to stagger it. I'll take these specific sections and drop them back down a couple of meters to create a tiered effect, then patch the gaps with wall segments. This is purely an aesthetic choice, but it serves a psychological purpose too. Since the player has to leap across this pit, having the ceiling height mimic the arc of a jump acts as a subliminal guide. It draws the eye upward and emphasizes the grand scale of the room while hinting at the path forward. Subtle level design cues like this can be incredibly effective. Even if a player isn't consciously aware of it, shaping the ceiling to mimic the arc of a jump provides a silent, helpful guide for those unsure of how to clear a gap. In fact, it's probably even more important to apply this in the previous room, where the player is first introduced to the jumping mechanic. Let's try it out. I'm deviating from the plan slightly here, but that's the nature of design. While I've been sticking to 4-meter height increments, you don't have to be that rigid. As long as you stay on the grid and keep your snapping active, feel free to move things by 1 or 2 meters to get the right feel. I'll duplicate these pieces and adjust the tiers. It doesn't matter if the geometry looks a bit messy or pokes out from the top, provided it's completely hidden from the player's perspective during gameplay. I'm noticing a bit of Z-fighting after those changes, so a quick playtest will help me identify the problem areas. Looking at it now, the tiered ceiling definitely reinforces that sense of direction. I'll go ahead and polish these minor alignment issues and finish placing the remaining columns off camera, as it's just more of the same refinement we've already covered. We're running a bit long, but I want to wrap up this final section before we finish. Just like we did with the first room, I'm raising this final area to create a visual blocker. As a player standing at the entrance, I shouldn't be able to see the very end of the level. Height adds mystery and breaks the line of sight. First, let's clean up the outliner to keep things organized. I'll select everything in the Room 5 folder, which grabs the entire end block, and raise it by 4 meters. Pro tip: if you spend a lot of time selecting specific objects and accidentally click off of them, just hit Ctrl+Z. Unreal will restore your previous selection without undoing your last movement, which is a massive time saver. With that raised and snapping set to 100, we're perfectly aligned. Now let's handle the transition. Since we've stuck strictly to the grid, we can reuse the same stair assets from earlier. I'll just drag them in, rotate them to face the platform, and snap them into place. Finally, I'll dormer the roof out slightly to give the stairs enough clearance. Simple, clean, and efficient. I believe 2 meters is what I used previously, which should work fine here as well. Looking at it from across the room, the view is much better. The staircase creates a natural barrier that hides the final area. The jump across still feels manageable, and the flow is exactly where I want it. We do have a small gap in the ceiling here, which I'll patch by extending these wall sections upward. My camera got a bit wild there for a second, but we're back on track. I'll also drop in some columns to mask the flickering Z-fighting on these surfaces, nudging them slightly to ensure a clean look. To wrap things up, I want to clearly mark the end of the level. Even though I'm working solo, it's good practice to leave clear indicators for yourself or any teammates. Until we add the final objective, like a treasure chest or a goal, I'll use a text render actor. You can find this by searching for text in the Place Actors panel. Just drag it into the scene, and in the Details panel, type in your text. I'll write end and scale it up so it's impossible to miss. I'll finish adding the remaining columns and fine-tuning the details off camera, but that covers the essentials. This concludes our second prototyping pass. We've successfully added visual variety and made some key functional adjustments to the ceiling heights to improve the overall player experience. Feel free to take this process even further in your own projects by adding multiple passes for extra detail like wall recesses or more intricate geometry. For this course, however, this completes our second prototyping phase. When we return, things get even more interesting. We'll shift our focus from layout to logic by scripting interactive elements. We're going to build the falling blocks, fire hazards, and various traps that will transform this environment into an actual playable game. I'll see you in the next video.